Welcome everyone to our third event in our Institute's Colloquium series on trusting science. I'm Stephanie Hood, I'm based in the Institute's communications team, and I'm really happy to welcome all of you familiar and new faces, members of the Institute and our external guests to one of several colloquia over the next academic year on the topic of trusting science. So just a bit of administration, we will be recording the lecture, the talk, but we won't be recording the Q&A. So if you ask any questions at the end, you will not be recorded. And I'd just like to thank everyone here who's been involved in organising the series. So our communications team, the research group members, our administration, and the library as well. And I'm very happy to welcome Pablo Ruiz de Olano, a research scholar in our Max-Planck research group, Historical Epistemology of the Final Theory programme, who has organised this session and will introduce today's colloquium. Pablo.
Thank you, Stephanie. So our speaker today is Professor Philip Mirowski from the University of Notre. So Phil is the Carl E. Koch Professor of Economics and Policy Studies at Notre Dame, and a faculty member at its PhD program in History and Philosophy of Science. And I should say that this is the PhD program that I graduated from, so I'm particularly glad and honored to introduce Phil's lecture today. In his 1989 book, More Heat Than Light, Economics as Social Physics, Phil advanced the thesis that economics has undergone several major stages throughout its history, each governed by a different metaphor that is used to explicate the central notion of value. After analyzing the rise of neoclassical economics in these terms, Phil would continue this project in his 2001 Machine Dreams, Economics Becomes a Cyber Science, where he defended the view that the foundational metaphor behind neoliberal economics is that of value as information, and of the market as a supercomputer that is capable of processing information faster than any human being, and is therefore bound to outperform any attempts at economic planning. This kind of research would then be continued with a number of works on the history of neoliberalism and its impact on the production of scientific knowledge. These include the work from Mont Pelerin, an edited volume on the making of the neoliberal thought collective, and his books Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, which chronicles the neoliberal handling of the 2008 economic crisis, The Knowledge We Have Lost in Information, co-authored with Edward Nick Ha, and Science Smart, Privatizing American Science. In this last book, Phil studied the transition of American science from a model dominated by public spending during the first few decades after World War II to a regime of commercialized science from the 1980s onwards. As the book shows, this resulted in a degradation of the quality of American science, as well as in a transformation of the very concept of scientific knowledge. In recent years, Phil has extended this treatment to investigate the nascent phenomenon of open science and the growing intrusion of platform capitalism in all stages of scientific research that it appears to entail, or facilitate at least. And so in the last year or so, I, along with others in my research group, have developed an interest on crisis narratives in science and on the idea that they might signal a genuine epistemic decline. And in discussing the topic of trust in science, I thought that it would be important to reflect on questions such as, is science always worth trusting? And if not, what kind of science should we trust? Science done under what circumstances? What conditions? And most of all, can the history of science help us answer these questions? I can't imagine anyone better than Phil to address these issues. And so without further ado, let me give the floor to him. So Phil, the floor is yours.
Okay, looks good. Everyone can see it? All right. I want to thank Pablo and Max Planck for this opportunity to report on updates to open science and its relationship to all kinds of other worries that we have about trust in science in the current situation. I also want to acknowledge the privilege of following Jessica Wang in the series, for those of you who've been watching it, because her thesis is similar to mine. She argued that issues of international cooperation and research were not just due to the self-organization of scientists themselves, but were often shaped by the states that they frequently represented. In a similar way, I want to argue that the re-engineering of modern science is not simply the result of the self-organization of scientists themselves, but instead is shaped by commercial interests, and in particular, in this talk, the interests of publishing conglomerates to which they often conceive themselves as standing in opposition. Okay, all right. Okay, let's go. Yeah, right. Come on. All right, why aren't the slides progressing?
I think you just click your screen, your PowerPoint screen. Yeah, I think now.
Yeah, that's it. Got it. Okay. One could approach this talk as derived from time-honored science studies of technology tradition, where we question the supposed neutrality of technological developments. But in this case, the technology has been deployed to alter the very practices of scientific research itself, and thus has very specific epistemic consequences. Social media, I want to argue, are not simply a different sort of stage upon which scientists can conduct the same types of performances that they have done in previous eras. And by the way, that's going to be one of the weaknesses of all these advocates of open science. I am, of course, not the first to think this. I would like to give a shout out to Mark Kerrigan's great book, The Public and Its Platforms. And the reason in the talk that I want to argue that it's not just reprocessing of the same kinds of performances is that the people who advocate this are blind to the various ways that prior presumed rules of discourse, citation, and validation are being dramatically revised by the platforms as they introduce them. And secondly, these people downplay the ways in which the social status and roles of university academics are being downgraded in tandem with these developments. Okay. Another pop way to understand this is to look at a parallel literature of what's been happening to journalism under the aegis of the introduction of social media. Okay. Indeed, for those of you who have heard of her, Caitlin Petra has a great book, All the News That's Fit to Print, where she reports on how the work situation of journalists has been radically transformed under the regime of social media. In particular, the growing partisan bifurcation of news, the epithet of fake news, is beginning to have analogs with regard to trust in science in the current era. Notice I'm bowing to the theme of these lectures here. Okay. All right. Now, what I want to argue is that people who are interested as to what's happening to science need to know quite a bit about something that seemingly is a little bit removed from the kind of standard stuff that people in science studies look at. And what they need to know is they need to know a little bit about the literature on platform capitalism. Now, I have some what I think of as the best sources on platform capitalism for those jumping into it. Nick Srinichek's book, Platform Capitalism, great. Again, Mark Kerrigan's book, Public and Their Platforms. And then Rahman and Talon have this article in Politics and Society on the rise of the platform business model, okay? So that's where this stuff is coming from, in case you're interested. But for the purposes of the talk, I just want to point out some aspects of platforms. Platforms are internet programs that support innovation interaction, but constrain participation in modes that profit the platform owners with the capacity to determine the conditions of social interaction, but not the actions themselves. Okay, people really need to meditate on that. That this is about controlling the conditions of your social interaction, but not really, top down the action itself. These sorts of platforms equate freedom of information with market freedom, and they have a tendency to encourage a sort of a rebellious aspect, which of course appeals tremendously to the young. They are reliant on network effects, so they result in winner-take-all situations, that platforms are rapidly kind of swallowed up by other platforms and come to dominate the system quite rapidly. They use cross-subsidization to draw more users into the network, often by offering services for free at the point of contact. So keep that in mind too, that you think you're getting something for free, but in fact, what's happening is a kind of a cross subsidization in order to monetize information gathering. And it treats the participants in the platform as independent contractors. And of course, the advantage of that is that the platform has no particular obligation to remunerate these participants. And of course, the platform gets around all kinds of regulations of hours, labor laws, and so forth. And they often end up as oligopolies or worse. Okay, this is generally characteristics of platforms that you need to keep in mind when we're talking about the ones that I'm going to tell you about today. Okay. Now, I want to thank Pablo for mentioning ScienceMart, which gets way less cites than my other work, but I think is probably the most important work for science studies that I've ever done. And I try to argue that actually we can periodize the various aspects of science according to large-scale government intervention and the ways in which research is paid for. And I did it for the United States, and I'm not going to talk about the earlier regimes, but I do claim in that book that we entered an era of globalized privatization in the 1980s, which has only kept rolling. I now believe, because the book is about a decade old, that the characterization of this current regime was inadequate in that book. It was too focused on the incursions of intellectual property management and the outsourcing of research to private firms like contract research organizations. Now, all of this is true and it's all happened. But what I now understand is that commercialization can assume many different formats, okay? And that these formats have been changing within this era of commercialization. So now I would claim that, in fact, we are in phase 2 of the commercialization regime, which only started around 2010. And this phase 2 is the subject of today's talk, that platform capitalism has been re-engineering research from the bottom up. And if you needed a kind of a catchphrase about this, I would say that markets under phase 2 are no longer restricted to the outputs of research. But now they are infused into every corner of the research process. So now the process is being marketized, not just the outputs. Now, here's my core thesis for today's talk. And it's kind of in the format of an ironic revenge drama. Okay, I kind of think of it like Jacobean or something like that. All right. Many scientists who pride themselves on the promotion of open science, and by the way, whoever is watching, I'm talking to you if you love open science. Okay. Many scientists who pride themselves in the promotion of open science as a means of attacking the evil Big Five publishing conglomerates who profit off their research have been in fact co-opted to further the ongoing commercialization of that research precisely through the auspices of open science. And those auspices are largely, but not exclusively, being deployed by the Big Five publishers. You see why it's a revenge drama? Okay. Of course, state bureaucracies are also complicit in the thoroughgoing exploitation and gamification of science under misleading motives of democracy and the reform of science. Probably don't have time to talk about that so much today, but I'm certainly willing to do that more in the Q&A and so forth. So what am I saying? The Big Five publishers were never going to just lie down and die. All right. They saw the writing on the wall. They've been aware that dead tree technologies, the days of dead tree technologies are numbered. And in a subtle move under the aegis of open science, they are busy building infrastructures to monetize and eventually control every aspect of the scientific research process. Okay. Now, there's a massive literature that quibbles over the meaning of open science. And again, I could do it if you wanted, but it's not important for right now. It is true that different advocates of open science often focus upon different parts of the agenda. But what's missing is that you have to see the logic of the entire agenda to see what's going on, okay? Of course, some people harp on free access to published or unpublished scientific papers, and of course, the evils of journals. Others imagine that citizen science will rectify a perceived lack of trust in science, hence again, nodding to the theme of these lectures. Others still feel that opening up the peer review process will improve the quality of findings and reports that have been having trouble lately, okay? These are all subsets of the larger project, even though individuals who are involved in it may tend to focus on only a part of it. And then that's also a problem for STS and historians, it seems to me. They have a bad case of elephantitis, okay? They grab the part and they get all excited about it. And, I understand that, trying to talk about big data, and what's big data about? Or what's the obsolescence of journals? Or is there something about the rectification of the problem of reliable replications? Or is it about regaining trust in science on the part of the unwashed? Or is it about rendering science more inclusive? You see, you can get all worked up about those individual parts, but if you don't see the big picture, you don't understand the motives and the interests who are behind open science, okay? Now, what's interesting is that the real advocates, the real ideologues of open science tend to move more indifferently between these wildly different phenomena, okay? Such as open access to existing scientific publications. See, if you just keep it down to there, who could get upset about wanting more access, right? Then there's stuff about different formats for the future of scientific publication. So that's kind of fascinating on its own terms. There's the open provision of scientific data. As you know, there's both a huge literature and a large push on the part of governments to somehow bring this about. There's a discussion of open peer review, opening up to larger audiences. There's the promotion of citizen science, and then the new world of the internet conduct of science. The reason I put them all on the same slide is I want to ask, what makes all of these things like each other? Okay. What is it that makes this a program as opposed to a bunch of individual supposed technological developments? All right. This, by the way, is from my open science, if you've had a chance to see it, my paper on open science in 2018 in Social Studies of Science. This is an attempt to get at what openness means. All right. And what it means, again, I'm being very fast here, is what it means is back in the old days, which, sounds a little weird, pre-2010, what happened was that there were parts of a research project, like when you're getting started, that you didn't really allow others to comment on or see. When you're reading around the literature, trying to decide what you're going to work on, when you're beginning to gather data and figure out how to gather data, when you're developing your working notes on, okay, so what's this research project really going to look like? And maybe even when you're beginning to draft initial reports on your project, like the draft paper. In the old days, the public would only enter in possibly at that later stage of drafting a paper and then the article itself being made public. What open really means to these people is that there is no part, there's no subset of the research process that isn't open to outsiders to intervene, to kibitz, and to influence, okay? And that's what I mean by this in this chart. By 2030, everything about the research process from the earliest inchoate stages to its final reports are going to be public, 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 okay? And what that means is that we're going to get rid of the old-fashioned scientific journals. See, they're the evil guys. Again, hence my Jacobean drama here. They're the evil guys. And then put all your activities online in real time to distribute your activity across many different participants of varied status. And I want to hammer that. See, they won't all be your, in Harry Collins' terms, your core set, right? No, they're going to be all kinds of different people from different backgrounds. You're going to fragment research processes into modular, semi-automated programs, hence the internet side of this. And this is the unspoken part. And I do mean there's an unspoken part. The reason all this is going to work, because on the face of it, why should it work at all? With all these, kibitzers and all these noisy, who knows who people, is because it will be coordinated by the market. And that's what will guarantee that this openness works. All right. Now, the way it's often talked about in public is not that way. In other words, I think I've presented it in a way that is much more harsh. What they tend to talk about is they talk about some kind of technological determinism, okay? And then they appeal to social media. And I'm sure you all have seen stuff like this, that what they say is, well, look, we have the examples of how social media works. And so, the younger the people are, the more they're used to this. So they understand how this openness would work, okay? And for that reason, that this open science kind of feels inevitable because we've got, not just one, but probably two generations who were brought up on social media. Of course, now it's TikTok, but back then it was Facebook and so forth, And so these forms of regimentation, we know, I'm channeling these people now. We know how they work, and our participants are familiar with them. So it's just the technology that makes us go for open science. You see, most open science people are, in a weird sort of way, kind of technological determinists. Okay, but I think what we need to see. And by the way, a number of people who have commented on this already see. I again want to give a shout out to Chris Newfield, who's been very good about this. That primarily, this is about breaking up the research project. Remember, it has all those aspects in an abstract timeline. Breaking up the research project into modular component parts. De-skilling the labor on many of those parts, and even possibly automating some of the research labor on other parts, okay? In the history of capitalism, this is often referred to as Taylorism. So, it's not like this hasn't happened before. It's just that this is what it looks like when it's brought to the scientific research process. And of course, the new business model downplays the earlier stress on controlling intellectual property of what results from the research. See, this is what's fascinating about it. First version of discussing commercialization got all upset about patents and do patents change research and blah, 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 okay? This isn't about that anymore. What it is about instead is extracting all manner of information from the process in real time, which can itself be a source of profit. Okay, see why this is different from the first phase of commercialization. Right? Now, on top of this, instead of destroying the big journals, the older scientific journal publishers, this is also partly about the scientific journal publishers repositioning themselves to an important locus of control within this newly re-engineered system, okay? And finally, For most of you, the relevant consideration is that this project seeks to undermine most existing academic protocols with regards to the organization of scientific labor. I can't stress this enough. Open science is about re-engineering how scientific labor works. Okay, it isn't about doing the same old stuff you used to do, only now online. Okay, and it replaces these earlier models with flexible temporary workers who can switch between research programs with alacrity when confronted with market signals. See, the market is central to this conception of how research will work. It will begin with Facebook-like platforms such as LinkedIn. I trust most of you are members of LinkedIn, right? All right. So here are the main components of a neoliberal reorganization of science. I'm just gathering them all together here. What you're going to do is you're going to destroy the legacy journals. But that doesn't mean that journals are going to go away, or at least the big five anyway. Okay. You are going to cheapen and de-skill the labor at various points along the research program. Okay. Moreover, the platform will provide a central panopticon for outsiders to monitor research programs. You see, this is part of where the sales of the information are going to go, right? Because there are many people, let's think of them as venture capitalists, who would love to know where the cutting edge of a research program is at the moment. You see this all the time in biomedicine, okay? And so what's going to happen is that that ability, which didn't exist before, to peer into in real-time scientific research and find out what it's doing and where it's going, is going to be sold. There are going to be so-called freely accessible data sets, and this in itself is a fascinating issue, because there's no such thing as a purely fungible data set. But Sabina Leonelli is very good on this, but we could talk about that more if you wanted. It's going to banish peer review, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. It's going to banish peer review in favor of likes and dislikes. All right. And then there's going to be a large component of citizen science. See, that's why citizen science is part of the open science movement, because a lot of the actual labor is going to be farmed out to unpaid citizens. Now, one thing that would occur to you is, why would all this huge disruption produce reliable knowledge? Well, these people have a faith that it will, because they believe that the market is the greatest information processor known to mankind. The market always knows more than you can ever know. And so the market will decide what the outputs in terms of truth value of this process will be, not so much the participants anymore. And then, of course, we have this other problem of what does this do for people's belief in the quality of the outputs? Well, all I can point out is, how well has Facebook worked out for political and social stability? Okay. Now, here are the main components of what I thought these platforms would look like back in 2018. I confess that this is old now. This is some work that I did, 5 years ago, where I was trying to use that notion of a table of the various beats during a research program, and then the various clientele down there in the columns of a research program, and see what kind of platforms existed out there in the world as of 2018 that would appeal to those various clienteles at the various points in research. And I'm sure most of you recognize at least some of these some of these platforms because you use them. LinkedIn, Mendeley, possibly Wallacea, possibly Zenodo, if you guys know about CERN, so forth and so on. Okay. This is the landscape that I saw 4 or 5 years ago. Now, you can also observe that the empirical component of this work involves a tremendous amount of digging that I think historians of science and even STS scholars have not been too thrilled to carry out. Okay. Maybe you need a thumbnail history of each of the platforms. Maybe you need, looking into how they're structured, so forth and so on. And then my story in 2018 was that this impending platform of science would get cobbled together the way many other big tech firms got consolidated, by gobbling up individual programs by a firm with deep pockets. And back then, I thought it would be something like Google or Amazon Cloud, who would eventually, either buy a whole row or a whole, possibly, something else, some combination of these, to produce one platform to rule over them all. Okay, that was me back in 2018. What I missed is that I wasn't paying attention back then to the actual scientific journal publishers themselves. Okay, and I feel bad about that now, because that's where I think the real action is. It isn't by Google or Amazon. It's by these guys who are, notice the top, we have the top 5 publishers there in terms of numbers of journals, actually how much they charge for public access, so forth and so on. Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, Blackwell, Taylor and Francis, and Sage. Okay. What I now have come to understand is that these are a major source of the consolidation of scientific research platforms. Okay. And the reason they're doing this is precisely to avoid the obsolescence that so many scientists have been predicting was going to beset their future. Okay. And I was alerted to this. Again, I'm not the first person to see this. There's a wonderful website called the Scholarly Kitchen for librarians who, of course, would pay attention to this, that have been tracking this for about 2 or 3 years now. Okay. So they had seen the dynamic and have been describing it to a certain extent. So I'm, leaning on them in order to flesh out this story. Okay. Now, the big 5 publishers have been price gouging universities for quite some time. And here I can lean on a report of the European Universities Association in 2017. They identified the American Chemical Society as the 5th largest publisher. But if you ignore that, then Sage takes its place. Okay. But I'm sorry, I have to do this because I want to be clear who my top 5 are. But if you look at Sage, Sage specializes almost entirely in the social sciences, whereas I'm concerned about those who want to re-engineer the natural sciences. So I accept that the others are the top 4. And what I would add is Claravit. Claravit is the private venture capital firm that bought Web of Science and is now itself trying to become a major platform in scientific research. Okay. Okay, here's the big reveal. Here's the, for those of you who need the quick and dirty story. The big 5, now as defined in the previous slide, having attained their status through horizontal integration of merging huge numbers of scientific journals, is now pursuing vertical integration through buying up component pieces of a platform to integrate the research process within their journal structure. They realize that this would result in end-to-end control of information flows. And by the way, this isn't me, imputing motives to them. They say this all the time, okay? It would integrate researcher profiles and hiring with workflows, with research tools, with data services, And then, of course, publishing, because that's where they already are, and the dissemination of findings. It would also evaluate the quality of these findings through metrics, automated analytics, and even laboratory and university rankings. See, again, people don't understand. University rankings are just a subset of this platform process, okay? I want to acknowledge I'm not the first to see this. There's a very interesting guy called Alejandro Posada. I don't know if anyone knows him, who wrote a paper describing how Elsevier wanted to own a platform that started with the development of the research question, notice number one there, through funding, through the collection of data to its analysis, to the write-up, and then through sending it through journals, that Elsevier had already bought a couple years ago various components of a platform that would do all those things. The difference between Posada and me is that he was just interested in Elsevier, whereas I want to stress this has become the business model of the top 5. Okay, they're all doing it now, which suggests to me this is where the real pressure for platformization of science is going to come from. All right. Now, I don't want to say that the top 5 are the entire waterfront of scientific research. I want to be careful about that. So I also want to acknowledge that there's this whole other subset of scientific reports that are called, by the way, by the big 5, predatory journals. Okay. And of course, those are the bad guys for the top 5. But really, predatory journals are part of this whole ecology as well. They just operate on a different notion of openness. They proliferate online journals that invest really nothing in editorial intervention. They spend no money on promotion of articles. They don't engage with alt metrics. There's no such thing as peer review. There's no presence at scholarly meetings, so forth and so on. In other words, these are the stripped down penumbra of the new open science, okay? These are the guys that let the big 5 re-engineer the research process, and then these take the dregs. and it's not so much that they're being evil, because they also believe in the market. See, that's the important part of this, that this neoliberal ideology of the market dominates them as well as the big 5. Their target group, their target clientele are the periphery, third world academics, languages other than as English, okay? That is, they're serving those client groups that are pretty much frozen out of the top 5. But those other people, they need validation too. And so that's what these other sectors do. They provide validation from those shut out from the top 5. Okay. Now, sorry if I'm hurrying fast, but there's so much of this that once you see it, you get started, you realize that, this is a huge structure that needs to be explored. For the historians, I want to insist that the big 5 publishers could never have constructed these platforms on their own, because they're not really sure what are the appropriate components to build into the platform. However, in the era of commercialized science, many natural science researchers have been encouraged to pursue commercial startups. I'm sure I'm telling you something you already know. But what's interesting is, most scientists don't get to have a startup because of their discovery, right? The vast majority of scientists can't have a startup, even though they're being told by their managers that they should, because of something that they've discovered. So what they can instead monetize is their own experiences of coding parts of the research process. And so a lot of the preliminary work has been done by scientists who have themselves seen some lacuna in the research process and have developed products, really, to address those lacuna, and then they turn those into startup firms, okay? So that's phase one. Phase one is you're told to commercialize something, and a lot of you are good at coding, so what you commercialize is some coded aspect of the research process that you've been involved in. And then along come the big five with their deep pockets, because they're so profitable, or at least used to be, and engage in large-scale mergers and acquisitions over the last decade. See, that's why timing matters. You needed a couple decades of people doing these startups for the big five to come along and then merge or acquire these startups using their exorbitant profits in order to consolidate all of these component parts into a larger platform, all right? This is, in their terminology, they call this leveraging brands to move up the value chain. I mean, you get used to this kind of B school talk because that's the kind of people who are running these things, okay? All right. This table is really my money shot here, okay, even though I'm sure you don't care. This table is what the big five publishers are doing right now, okay? This is the part that I didn't understand in 2018. That the big five have bought up so many of these components that many of them are well on their way to having platform components from the various earliest stages of research through data collection, data evaluation, processing, through to composing reports and then having those reports evaluated, such that they are, in a sense, the vanguard of the new platform capitalism in science, all right? Elsevier, as I've already told you, has gotten some attention in the literature, and there what you see are all of the components that they've bought up. By the way, I'm sure some of you are at least have touched your lives a little bit with these. You know, Mendeley, Scopus, Digital Commons, Sightseer, so forth. I mean, you may use some part of these without understanding that they are part of a larger platform. I think the one publisher that's farthest ahead in the game is Holtzbrinck, who, by the way, is German, all right? They are the owner of Springer Nature, but they also own something known as digital science. And digital science is the powerhouse of platform capitalism and research, as far as I can tell, all right? And so you got the name of many of those components there in our table, okay? So you can see what they have that they offer. And I think even relative to the big five, they are the ones who are farthest along in the development of these platforms. There you have Clarivate. Clarivate also has a well-developed set of components of the platform. Although I'm sure some of you have encountered it in Web of Science or Publons, so forth and so on. Wiley seems to be the one that's farthest, or the least far along, let's put it that way. And perhaps the reason is that they consider themselves much more oriented towards the education process than the research process. And it really shows in their attempt to buy up components of this kind of system. By the way, this table, I know it doesn't seem like much to you. This took me a month. There is no place that you can go to see all this information consolidated in one place. There's just no place, okay? There's no historian, there's no B school person, okay? This is happening, but no one is looking down on it as a larger general process and trying to summarize it, okay? I also want to acknowledge that my table makes the entire phenomenon look way more orderly than it really is, okay? I have to be realistic here. There are other firms that are trying to do this too, and one or two nonprofits also have similar ambitions. I want to keep that in the back of our mind, that nonprofits think they can build the platforms and not make profit. But this makes it harder to comprehend the various business plans. For instance, there's a firm called Frontiers, and some of you may have encouraged its journals in natural sciences, that publishes a stable of journals and has its own platform around Loop and IRA. These are just its components. However, Holtzbrink owns a minority stake in Frontiers, so in reality, it's not entirely separate from the seemingly separate platform. See, so there are lots of other platforms around there, but they are already in part being invested in by the big five journals, okay? I think it's curious that a month search has not turned up any survey of all these attempts to construct scientific platforms. There's a further aspect that deserves a separate talk that I can't devote here. Notice I haven't mentioned things like wet labs. And by the way, biosciences, biomedicine is one of the places where you see a lot of this stuff happening early. None of the big five publishers have an automated wet lab capacity as a subset of their platforms. But this has been a major project of big pharma, okay? Many firms such as Lilly are quite far along in constructing an end-to-end platform for clinical trials and drug exploration. But they are entirely proprietary and in-house, so they'll never grow to be an all-purpose research program platform. Nevertheless, drug research is one of the most automated areas in contemporary science, okay? So I don't want to sound like the big five publishers are the only ones doing it. Notice I'm being aware of other areas where there's attempts to do this as well. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so I just want to comment on a couple of the components of the platforms now, okay? And one component that doesn't get played up a lot in open science literature is not only do they want to automate and re-engineer things like writing up a paper, analyzing data, so forth. They also want to automate the whole process of getting funds in order to carry out a scientific research program. So you have to understand that this really, the ambitions of this are way larger than the open science people often admit, all right? There are a large number of dedicated platforms for crowdfunding of scientific research. And I have a somewhat old table. It's about, I don't know, what is it? It's from 2018, so it's about 4 years old now. So notice, we're not talking just one platform. We're talking about a number of platforms, many of which are active, some of which have failed, that attempt to crowdsource funding for individual scientific research programs. And what we see here is science that offer a circumvention of the long and complex process of standard grant proposal cycles. Okay, notice that's also going to get re-engineered. This old idea that you had to spend 6 months writing up a grant proposal and then wait another 6 to 9 months to actually hear about it and so forth. No. These guys say, nah, we can do it just for your research process, your program, and we can do it quickly. All right. But you should notice that for most of them, that much like Kickstarter, which is a generic crowdfunding program, they take a cut in the form of profits. In other words, see, this is also a profit-making activity. All right. These alternative funding sites have gone mainstream during the current pandemic. This is another thing that I've noticed. If you look at the article in The Atlantic, America Needs a New Scientific Revolution of November 5, 2021, you will encounter PR for a new website called Fast Grants. which describes an application process for biological research funding designed to take half an hour with decisions delivered in just a few days. Okay. The article neglects to explain that it was started up by a famous neoliberal propagandist, Tyler Cohen, and Silicon Valley VCs. So that tells you where these ideas come from. All right. A little side note on that one. It was so popular that once it was promoted in the Atlantic, its website crashed and is still not restored. So much for that being the total solution to not, to getting an NIH grant. Okay. Let me briefly say something about citizen science too. Citizen science is an amazingly ungrounded wish. All right. It's interesting that governments have been the most concerned to fund and promote citizen science platforms. You find this in the United States with NSF, and the EU has been a big promoter of citizen science. But really the question is, what is citizen science supposed to accomplish? Do you honestly think that getting people involved in some tangential part of a research process is going to make them love science? I mean, this is a crazy proposition. So the question is, what's really going on with citizen science? Basically, there's a thin line between de-skilling research labor and promoting university PhD as temp laborers. See, both are going on in platform capitalism, that you're de-skilling, but you're also providing platforms to have PhDs being hired at lower class and temp jobs. Okay. There are so many PhDs around right now who can be recruited that that's really where the action is in platform capitalism at the moment. But, that's not going to last forever. I mean, kids are already wising up. Why do I get a PhD and then, end up being yet another, temp laborer? All right. Once that pool is exhausted, and I predict it'll be exhausted soon, what's going to be happen is that this is going to be the source of de-skilling of research. In other words, as much research that can be de-skilled will be de-skilled under the rubric of citizen science. And of course, for-profit online training to be a citizen scientist is, of course, the next stage, and it's already there. Now, I don't want to make it sound like, and probably I'm going to close on this note. I don't want to make it sound like STS hasn't seen any of this, but they've seen parts of it, but they don't understand the bigger implications. Okay, and an article with regard to citizen science that I would like to cite is one that was recently. It hasn't been published yet in the Social Studies of Science, but it's on their website as going to be published by Baudry et al. And basically what it does is it looks at a couple of very important citizen science projects, all right? And they are Boink, Zooniverse, and iWire. I don't, it would take me forever to explain them. I'm not going to do it here. But what they did was they tracked what happened to them as standalone projects. And when they started out, they were pretty harmless. So for example, I'm sure some of you have heard of SETI at home, right? Looking for evidence of intelligence in the universe by scanning signals and so forth. Okay, fine, that's harmless. What's the big deal? But what you come to learn is as the projects get bigger, they don't scale very easily. Okay. They can't handle huge growth very easily. And so what happens is that they have to find other ways to fund the ongoing process of citizen science, okay? Because even though the government might have provided some seed money, they're not going to fund this huge scaling up. And so what happened is that they went from just being about that particular research project to being instead about generic open science setups. The same thing happened to them that happened to many of the scientists who privatized and in startups their own coding projects. Okay, what they've done in these particular instances is that they have started selling their platform as generic platforms that could be sold to start other kinds of citizen science projects, but also games. I think this is fascinating, that part of this is being taken over by the computer gaming industry. Because of course, how do you get a bunch of dumb people involved in a scientific research process? Well, you make it fun, okay? You make it fun like a game. So in fact, this stuff is quickly converging with the gaming industry, okay? So what's my point here? So this is a great article, but I don't think they understand the implications very well. Even harmless nonprofit citizen science projects get co-opted and re-engineered as for-profit platforms, because that is the logic of open science. All right. Okay, look, I got some more slides, but I'm basically what I'm doing is I'm just commenting again on these other pieces that I've seen. Okay, so I think it would be better to open it up to questions now. Okay.
Thanks to Phil. That was a really excellent talk, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yep.
And thanks also to our colleagues from the library team and the communications team who helped organize it. Before we all part, I wanted to leave the floor to Cheryl, who's going to introduce the next talk in our series. So Cheryl, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Pablo. So for our next event, which will happen on April 5th, we will be hosting a conversation between Clapperton Chakanetsa-Mavunga, who is a professor of STS at MIT, and Helen Tilley, who is associate professor of history and law at Northwestern. Both of these scholars have conducted extensive research in African context and share deep concerns about methodology as it relates to different regional specializations in the history of science, about relationships between coloniality and knowledge, and also about systemic racism in science. So through this conversation, we hope to open up a set of questions and also possibilities for action that are related not only to scholarship, but also to institutional practices. And our title is still a work in progress, so there might be some changes. Stay tuned for that. And hopefully see all of you back here on April 5th. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for being here.